Hi, I'm Nancy. Welcome to my channel, A Square Pillow Isn't Square, the place where you will find anything and everything you wanted to know about home deck sewing. I recently made this little functional cloud shade for a customer, and I thought it would be a good time to show you one of my favorite tricks, which is the fastest and easiest way to sew Roman shade rings onto the back of a shade. So here's our shade, flat on my work table, almost all finished. And just to show you how much time this saves, I cut, prepped, and sewed all of these rings on and took the time to stop and make some recordings and photos for this video, all in under 2 hours flat. This video today is just about my trick for sewing on rings, so I'm not going to talk about all of the instructions to make a Roman shade here. I'll do that in a future video. So today I just want to let you know what you need for this project other than the normal things you'd have to make your Roman shade. The only thing that you really have to have for this is some really strong thread. Your basic lightweight cotton or cotton wrapped sewing thread isn't going to be the best choice. So here's a few different kinds of thread. They're shown in different colors. I almost always recommend white to match your lining, but just to show you some different kinds of threads that I would use for this project. They are a strong nylon thread or a strong 100% polyester thread. So I have some upholstery weight threads here, and you can see this Coats and Clark polyester wrapped polyester, which is the lightest weight thread that I'd recommend, but still perfectly acceptable. I like using polyester thread on the back of my shades because it's less resistant to sun damage and rot and so forth from UV rays than cotton or other types of fibers. Okay, let's get to it. First thing you're going to do is you are going to take a piece of thread that is twice the length of your shade, and you're going to run it through your needle so that you have 2 layers of this, a very strong thread running through your needle that will go the entire length of your shade. You're going to start at the top, and you're going to take a small tack going through both layers of fabric in the first mark for where to place your Roman shade ring on the top of that row. You are only going to be making 1 stitch at each mark, so it's really important that you go through all the layers, both the lining and the face fabric, but you don't want to make the tack any larger than it has to be. Now we're just going to continue that process down that entire vertical row up until the last shade at the bottom hem. And the way that I do that is because it's easy to pick up the fabric and feel if you're going through when you're on an outside edge, but as you get farther into the body of the shade, it's hard to pick it up without shifting all the layers. So I kind of poke my needle in until I feel that I've gone through, and then I just take a small tack on the back, and with a little bit of practice, you're going to feel whether or not you've gone through both layers of fabric. You can always turn it over to check when you're done and go back and re-sew one if you've missed one, but with a little practice, you're going to see that you can take a small tack. It'll be barely visible on the front of the shade, and you're going to do that on each row, stopping right before the bottom hem. I like to sew the bottom ring on a little bit differently. So these are the only rings, the rings along the bottom horizontal row, the hem line, are the only rings that I sew on individually. And the reason I do that is because most of the other shades are most of the other shade rings are guide rings, but the bottom ring takes all the weight. It takes most of the stress and the weight when the shade is raised and lowered. So I like to give this one a little bit extra reinforcement. So I sew it on just the typical way you would. You knot your thread, you sew it on going through 2 or 3 times, and then tie it off at the end. That way that bottom row of rings is going to be super strong. And as you see, I also take a little tack through that fold at the bottom where the fabric's even going to be extra strong. So I'm never going to risk the chance of pulling a hole through the fabric or doing anything that will weaken the integrity of the shade. You are going to repeat this process for every vertical row of rings that you need to sew on. I highly recommend leaving your shade flat on your work surface during this entire process. In fact, I make an entire Roman shade without moving it on my table until it's time to sew the bottom hem or the top hem, the very last step that I do. And the reason I do that is just easier to not have the fabric layers shifting and have to always straighten it and square it up. So I like to keep it flat. However, if you're having trouble sewing your little tacks or just getting your line sewn without moving your shade, without being able to get your hand up underneath of it, you can put a pin through both layers at every spot where you're going to tack a shade ring, and that way when you move your fabric around to try and get better access to where you got to sew these lines, your layers aren't going to shift. Now that you have a nice continuous row of running stitches down all the vertical lines of your shade, the next thing you're going to do is snip the threads halfway in between the mark where each shade ring is going to go. Now just tie your rings on. I do that with a double square knot. A square knot is simply where you tie the right over left and left over right. As you can see here, I'm doing the left over right and doing it twice, and then I'm doing the right over left and doing it twice. Double square knot. Make sure you have it tied nice and tightly, and you just simply go down and do that on every single mark where your shade rings are supposed to go. All right, we're almost done. Next thing you do is you trim your threads. You do not want to trim these too short. I'd say no less than a half an inch, maybe about 3/4 of an inch. But just go across your shade and trim all of your threads. And then the last thing that I do is I touch a bead of glue. If you have a small spout on your fabric glue, craft glue dispenser, you can just touch it, touch the spout to each knot and get a little bit of glue on there. Mine, the kind I have, is kind of big and too much comes out, so I tend to put a little bit on my finger and just go down and touch each knot and reload my finger as I go. Just a little bit of extra insurance to make sure your knots don't come untied. The first time through washing this, it might seem like a little bit of a tedious process, but trust me on this one. Once you get familiar with the steps, you do them all in assembly line process. Boom, 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 do your running stitches. Boom, 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 snip all of your threads on your whole shade. Tie all of your rings on. You kind of do it all in assembly line method. You get really fast at it. The whole process goes really quickly. Put a little background music on. Before you know it, your entire shade is going to have its rings sewn on in probably a third of the time it would take to individually knot, sew, and tie off each ring. If you found this video helpful, please consider subscribing to my channel so you know when I post new videos. I appreciate you stopping by today. Thanks for watching and happy sewing.